All right. Are you ready? Today we are tackling a huge question, one that has honestly sparked debates for centuries. What does it even mean to be great?
Ooh, that's a good one.
For this deep dive, you shared a conversation between two historians from the podcast The Rest is History. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, yeah. They're
A
familiar.
fascinating listen for sure. And we're going to extract the juiciest bits from it. And then, of course, we'll be adding our own takes on how this whole idea of greatness has shifted throughout history.
You know what's really intriguing to me is how this historical evolution of greatness, it's not just some abstract academic concept. It actually reveals a lot about how we, even today, view power, leadership, and influence.
Okay, so let's rewind way back to the ancient world, where this very notion of being great first kind of popped up. Our historians pointed out that it all started with the Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen at that
It
time.
was massive.
Their ruler was known as the Great King, which reflected not only his political authority, but also the sheer scale and reach of his empire.
You see, back then, size and scale were basically inherently linked to power. The vastness of the Persian Empire was awe-inspiring and in a way terrifying. Conquering and controlling such a vast territory demonstrated an almost superhuman level of strength and capability.
It's like that old saying, go big or go home, right? But instead of going home, they were conquering it. And this connection between size and power, it's not just some ancient relic, is it?
Not at all. Think about how we still use the term great today. A great company is often one that has a massive market share. A great city is often one that sprawls across miles and miles. We're still drawn to this idea of bigness as an indicator of importance and influence.
It's almost like it's hardwired into us, right? Like we're still impressed by things that are big and bold and expansive.
For sure.
But the story of greatness doesn't end with the Persians.
Enter Alexander the Great Conqueror of Persia and well-adopter of the title Great King, of course. After conquering the Persian Empire, Alexander essentially inherited the mantle of greatness, and it wasn't just a symbolic gesture. By adopting the title, Alexander was consciously aligning himself with the legacy of the Persian emperors, claiming their power and prestige for himself.
And let's not forget, Alexander was a master of self-promotion. He knew that a catchy title like the Great would stick in people's minds and solidify his legacy. And you know what? It worked. His successors were all vying for the same title, desperate to prove that they too were worthy of being called great.
Absolutely. And a Roman's always keen on shaping historical narratives solidified the concept by officially bestowing the title Magnus, meaning the Great, on Alexander. This cemented his place in Western thought, making him the archetypal figure of the great conqueror.
So right from the start, this idea of greatness is entangled with military might, conquest, and empire building. It's almost like you couldn't be considered great unless you were expanding territory and amassing power.
That's a really insightful observation, and it raises some interesting questions about how our understanding of greatness has evolved. Because as we move into the modern era, things start to get a lot more complicated.
That's where things get really interesting, right? Because this connection to military might continues, but then starts to unravel a bit. The historians pointed out that when you look at Wikipedia's list of figures labeled the Great, it pretty much ends in the 18th century with folks like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And yeah, they were all about solidifying their power and expanding their empires.
And it's crucial to understand this in the context of how history was being written at the time. Victorian historians were obsessed with crafting national identities, and they saw these great men as the driving force behind historical progress. These figures were held up as the architects of nations, the ones who shaped destinies and left an indelible mark on the world.
So we're seeing how these historical narratives, these ideas about who deserves to be called great, are actually products of their time. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it, how our own ideas about greatness might be shaped by the world we live in.
Precisely. And speaking of challenging those assumptions, the historians brought up a really fascinating question. Why is George Washington not known as George Washington the Great?
Right. He was a founding father, a
Yeah.
pivotal figure in the birth of a nation, and certainly someone who left an enormous mark on history. So why didn't each get the Great label? Is there something about republics that makes us hesitate to bestow that title?
That's a brilliant question, and it points to a fundamental tension that emerges as we move into the modern era. Democracies, by their very nature, are built on the idea of equality. The notion of one person being inherently superior to all others clashes with those egalitarian ideals.
So while America certainly has its founding fathers, figures who are revered and memorialized, it seems to resist that specific title of the Great. It's almost like that label is seen as being at odds with the principles of a democratic society.
Exactly. And it's not just about political systems either. Even in the 20th century, we see figures like Ataturk, who completely reshaped Turkey, but they don't universally get that great designation. It suggests that a shift is happening in how we define and view greatness.
So if it's not just about military achievements and empire building, then what is it about? What's causing this shift? What are we starting to value instead?
It seems like the emphasis is shifting away from raw power and military achievements towards something more, well, more moral.
It's becoming less about conquering land and more about conquering hearts and minds, right?
Yes. And the historians highlighted some incredibly compelling examples. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., even figures like Rosa Parks. These individuals are seen as great, not because they commanded armies or built empires, but because they fought for justice, equality, and human dignity.
They're not remembered for their military strategies or political maneuvering, but for their unwavering moral stances, their courage in the face of oppression, and their ability to inspire millions to work for a better world.
And what's fascinating here is the connection to sainthood. These figures evoke a similar kind of reverence and inspiration that was once reserved for religious figures. They've become almost like secular saints, guiding us toward a more just and compassionate world.
It's like they're showing us that true greatness lies not in dominating others, but in lifting them up. But of course, things are never that simple, right? There are always nuances and complexities. The historians then brought up a figure who seems to straddle both sides of this evolving definition of greatness, Winston Churchill.
Ah, yes, Churchill. He embodies that classic idea of greatness, the wartime leader, the brilliant strategist, the man who rallied a nation against seemingly insurmountable odds. He's the kind of figure who in the past would have been unequivocally hailed as great. But today, things are different.
Modern audiences are starting to grapple with some of his less than stellar personal views, particularly on race and colonialism. And that raises a really important question. Can we still consider someone great if they hold beliefs that we now recognize as harmful and unjust?
And this is where things get really interesting, because it suggests that the very meaning of greatness is under debate, being reevaluated in light of our evolving values and understanding of the world. What was once celebrated military prowess, strongman tactics, is now being scrutinized through a new lens.
So it's not just about adding new criteria for greatness like moral impact. It's about questioning the old criteria as well. And that's something that each of us as consumers of history and participants in the present needs to grapple with.
Absolutely. And as we move forward in this deep dive, I want you to keep this question in mind. What does greatness mean to you? What qualities do you admire? Whose legacy do you find inspiring? And why? Because the answers to those questions reveal a lot about our own values and how we view the world. It's like we're in the middle of this huge shift. The old yardsticks for greatness are being challenged, but we haven't really figured out what the new ones should be.
It makes you wonder if we're even asking the right question. What if instead of trying to define greatness in these individualistic terms, we started thinking about it more collectively?
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
You're right. We do tend to fixate on those heroic narratives, those great men who supposedly single-handedly changed the course of history. But what about the unsung heroes, the everyday people who, through their actions, actually make a real difference?
Right. Think about all the movements we see today fighting for social justice, climate action, human rights. These aren't driven by one singular leader with a great title. They're powered by countless individuals working together towards a common goal.
That's a powerful observation because it really challenges us to broaden our perspective on what a meaningful legacy actually is. What if instead of just focusing on individuals, we started recognizing the greatness that exists in these collective efforts, the power of communities coming together to actually create change?
It's like we're moving away from that whole great man theory of history and embracing a more nuanced, more multifaceted understanding of how change happens.
And think about how liberating that could be. If greatness isn't reserved for a select few, if it's something we can all contribute to in our own unique ways, then suddenly the possibilities become much more expansive.
It's like greatness becomes less about individual ambition and more about collective action, recognizing the power of community and shared purpose to achieve remarkable things.
That's a really compelling point. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, the pursuit of greatness itself is undergoing a transformation.
And this shift is happening against a backdrop of all this huge societal change, the rise of democracy, the fall of empires, the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. All of this is contributing to how we redefine greatness.
Absolutely. And this isn't just an abstract philosophical debate either.
Yeah.
This shift in how we perceive greatness has very real-world consequences.
Because if we're no longer celebrating leaders primarily for their military conquests, does that change how we view war and conflict?
It's a crucial question to consider. And on the flip side, if we start valuing different forms of leadership, compassion, collaboration, empathy, could that lead to different kinds of policy decisions, different priorities for our nations and our world?
What if greatness for a nation became less about military and economic dominance and more about things like social progress, environmental sustainability, even cultural influence?
It's like the whole scorecard for greatness is being rewritten for both individuals and for nations. This deep dive is seriously making me question everything I thought I knew about leadership and legacy.
Me too. It's prompting me to really re-examine my own assumptions about what it actually means to make a positive impact on the world.
And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It allows us to examine the past, not just for what it was, but for what it can teach us about ourselves and the world we want to create.
You know, the historians we're discussing, they ended their conversation without a definitive answer. They didn't tell us whether greatness is dead or alive.
I think that's the whole point. It's not about finding a simple answer. It's about engaging in this ongoing conversation, being willing to challenge our own perspectives, and recognizing that the very concept of greatness is constantly evolving.
They left us with a question that has really stuck with me. Is the very concept of greatness inherently flawed? Or can it be reimagined in a way that is relevant and inspiring for the 21st century?
It's a question that demands some serious reflection, not just from historians and scholars, but from all of us. What do you believe? What qualities do you think define greatness in our modern world?
Who are the individuals or the movements that you find truly inspiring? These are questions I encourage you to keep exploring long after this deep dive is over.
Because ultimately, the future of greatness, it's not something that's preordained. It's something we actively shape through our choices, our values, and our actions. So go out there, be curious, engage in thoughtful conversations, and maybe, just maybe,
you'll discover a spark of greatness within yourself. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
It's amazing, isn't it? As we've been talking about this whole idea of greatness, it's like we always go back to these grand sweeping narratives.
Well, yeah, for sure.
You know, empires rising and falling, wars being won, nations being forged.
The big stuff. But what if greatness is also sometimes found in like the quieter, more everyday moments of life?
That's such a good point. We often get so caught up in those huge, larger-than-life stories, right? Like those figures who seem to just like stand astride history and shape everything. But what about those countless acts of courage, kindness, and resilience that happen all around us, literally every single day? What if those are expressions of greatness too?
Exactly. Think about it. The single parent working 2 jobs to provide for their family, the teacher going above and beyond to inspire their students, the volunteer dedicating their time to help those in need. These might not be the stories that, make headlines or get statues built for them,
Right.
but they embody a kind of quiet greatness that is just as impactful, if not more.
Totally. And maybe shifting our focus to recognize and celebrate these everyday forms of greatness could have a profound impact on how we actually live our lives.
Yeah, and how we interact with the world around us.
For sure.
It's like we're saying, hey, you don't have to conquer a nation or lead an army to make a difference. You can find greatness in how you show up for your family, your community, even for strangers.
I love that.
And imagine if we started teaching our kids about these different types of greatness.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of just focusing on the, traditional heroes and conquerors. What if we also highlighted the stories of everyday people who made a difference through their compassion, their creativity, their perseverance?
It could totally change how we see ourselves in the world. Maybe we'd start to see greatness not as something distant and unattainable, but as something that's within each of us.
Like it's waiting to be nurtured and expressed.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a challenge. Let's all try to shift our perspective. Let's start noticing and celebrating the greatness that exists all around us in the everyday acts of kindness, courage, and creativity that honestly make our world a little bit brighter.
I'm in. Because maybe, just maybe, greatness isn't actually dead. It's just evolving, taking on new forms, waiting to be discovered in the most unexpected places. And hey, who knows? You might even find it within yourself.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for the greatness that surrounds us all.